Chapter 12. A Wedding Made in Fazakirley. When I got to the church, I sat next to Leroy and Claudia and little Evangeline. Further down the row was Nancy, Claudia's friend, who had played a major part when we managed to fix Mr. Devlin and old Harry. I remember the outfit she had on that night, and to be honest, the clothes she was wearing for the wedding had a similar, and therefore nostalgic, quality to them. I noticed, for example, that the blouse she was wearing was almost transparent, and it looked like she was wearing very little underneath it, perhaps nothing at all, because I have to admit her breasts bobbled, and you could see dark areas of, I have to say, nipples. Also, her white skirt was very short and very tight, and if I was the kind of person, I would have found myself looking at her throughout the ceremony. But being the kind of person I am, with, I suppose, not much of what they call a sex drive, I didn't. I began to wonder to myself whether Claudia had something in mind for old Harry again. Of course, the ceremony was not to everyone's taste. Claudia said, "I could have done without the sermons from the priest there, you know. I mean, what's the point of saying, what was it? Those of you unmarried who live across the threshold of sin should find an example here of two decent people making a sacramental statement of their love. Blah-de, blah-de, blah. And then what was it? Oh, yeah. And those of you who live in this sinful manner can expect a rotten hell, and I would appreciate it if there are any of this sort in this congregation, they leave the church at once and take their ungodly habits and sexual preferences with them." Something like that. I mean to say, at a wedding, like, you don't want that kind of stuff, do you? Okay, me and Leroy, like, we're doing it across the brush, and okay, I'm supposed to be a friggin' Catholic, and I do believe in God and all that, but I don't know what he was on about. All the people round these bloody parts fanatics or what? Two decent people, for Christ's sake. That bloody Alf Speed's a walking urine and sleep factory. What of all the Guinness and... I mean, how many times Leroy's had to cover for that bastard after one of his sessions? And with all due respect, that mother of yours is hardly a shining pillar of chastity. With what is it, 7 or 8 children? Oh, I don't know, I said, because I didn't actually know for a fact how many brothers and sisters I had. Bastards? 7 or 8 of them are actually bastards. And even though our Evangeline's one as well, at least she's clean. Which was true, because she was decked out in the most beautiful dress I had ever seen a child wear. My own brothers and sisters looked as though they had been knitted from some special urchin's shop where you could only buy dirty clothes that didn't fit, paid for by coupons from the DSS. In addition, my younger siblings, that's what they call them these days, all seemed to have terrifying snotty noses, and green stuff at that, which they just wipe away with their sleeves. This little trick was a major distraction during the marriage service. Anyway, the first break accepted from accepted tradition was when the bride and groom left the church to go to the hotel, because Alf, wanting to save a few bob for the do, had cut expenses elsewhere. He hadn't bothered with cars. Next thing you know, bloody Tommy's out there with Alf's truck, all done up with tin cans and shaving foam. I have to add that because of Tommy's slight illiteracy, the message on the truck said, "Just married. God look." I noticed the priest borrowing the shaving foam and changing the spellings, him still in his vestments as well. Next thing we saw was Alf, with his hand under my mother's anus, I suppose, pushing her up into the cabin of the wagon. Tommy gave a blast on the horn, and off they went. "Don't you look nice, considering?" said Nancy, when we finally got to the Happy Piper Hotel in Fazakirley. Of course, I knew Nancy was being polite, and that she must have thought I was suffering from some kind of loyal embarrassment over what my mother was wearing. I know you're supposed to look your best for a wedding, but my mother also seemed to think you should look your fattest. The thing is, after a lifetime of steak and kidney pie and chips, and the drink as well, I suppose my mother must be about 20 stone. The dress she had on was one of those clingy satin things with frills around the neck, as tight as a drum skin. I've heard this expression, sack of potatoes, being used to describe a woman's figure, and here it would have suited, except a sack of turnips might have been better. I reckon if she coughed too loud, the dress would have split right across, leaving her half naked, her stomach bulging out like a burst sausage. Another thing about the dress. After being in that wagon, she must have picked up some oil from the seat. Funny enough, the stain was right on her arse, roughly where Alf had placed his hand to help her into the cabin. I wondered whether Alf would remember to wash his hands before the wedding. When I asked him later, he told me that he'd needed to look at the engine before Tommy took the van away. As dinners go, it wasn't bad. It was a 4-course meal. The menu was prawn cocktail or melon surprise, roast lamb, roast and boiled potatoes, peas and cauliflower with gravy and mint sauce, then sherry trifle or fruit salad and fresh cream, cheese and biscuits and coffee, drinks, wine, white and red, champagne. I was genuinely surprised by all of this, and actually getting a little card with my name on it, and all of that, waitress service as well. Thing is, they didn't give seconds. When the dinner was over, I wandered over to Alf and said how much I enjoyed it. 15 quid a throw, Ace. They asked me if I wanted the luxury with the fish course, like, but that was an extra 3 quid, so I told them to piss off. Anyway, yeah, kid, I'm glad you liked it, but give me a bit of your mother's home cooking any day, Ace. Or should I call you son, as you're now my stepson? I couldn't bring myself to call Alf Speed Dad, so I wandered off to talk to someone else. Anyway, Alf was getting the ale in. Of course, no wedding is complete without speeches, and this is where the problem started. Because, of course, my mother's father being dead, and Tommy being so-called best man, but possibly missing his full shilling, there was only Alf to make the speeches. Alf, of course, is well known for his skill using the native tongue. I've heard it's standard practice at a wedding to sell dirty jokes, so here goes, he said. There was 3 sailors landed in Singapore. He went on to tell some absolutely disgusting joke that involved pineapple rings and a blob of cream with cherry on top. The joke didn't really seem to please many of the guests, especially Alf's own relatives, who made up 75% of them. Mainly, they seemed to be Irish, what with all the Guinness and that, so I suppose they didn't go in for dirty jokes. Mind you, Claudia and Leroy were having a hoot of a time. Later they said they couldn't help laughing because Evangeline had asked them why the priest had swallowed his champagne and left the room when Alf was making his speech. What wrong with the pineapple man? It's a good thing if suck, not true, said Leroy. The rest of Alf's speech was a statement of how he had come to fall deeply in love with my mother. What he said was that he had met her in an adult education institute where they were both studying contemporary literature. This, of course, was total fabrication, but the ahs and oohs that came from the aunties and old folk must have given Alf great encouragement. They might have just been glad to avoid any further embarrassment or obscenity. He then went on to say that he had proposed to her on a Mersey ferry boat beneath a full moon. This was another fabrication, because if what Alf told me in the past was true, they agreed to get married one night after Alf had had his 3rd portion of steak and kidney pie and decided it made no sense buying them from a chip shop when you could get them free at home. He went on to say how delighted he was, and how lucky he was to find such a wonderful woman to make a man of him, and expecting to lead the bachelor's life into old age. Fortunately, he said, now the searching's over, and the woman of my dreams has stepped through the door of fate and into my living room of love, with the sofa of friendship and the armchairs of respect resting on the carpet of loving. He then asked everyone to stand and make a toast to his own lovely bride of a few minutes. There were cheers and hoorays, and people clamouring for my mother to make a speech. Pull the other one, it's got bells on, she said. You're not going to get a bloody speech out of me, wedding or no wedding. There was then another break, with the tradition of holy matrimony, when it was announced that Tommy, of all people, who said there wasn't going to be any cake. Oh, listen, there's no cake, like, he said. If any of you want to know why, well, you can find out tonight. And I'm under me Alf. I'm under me boys' brigade's honour not to tell what's going to happen. But it's not cake, that's for sure. I heard one of the guests say something to the effect that that's all you could expect from people who live in Fazacurly, which I took as an insult but didn't act on. But there was work to be done that evening. The whole thing wasn't a celebration. There was the little matter of about 20 anonymous letters to deal with. I pulled Claudia over towards me during the meal and asked her what was going on. She said Leroy wouldn't be able to do anything until the evening, when old Harry would be at my mother's house enjoying the free booze and food. And whatever else he can lay his hands on, which is why I brought Nancy. Nancy along. She'll be able to keep the old bastard occupied. Should keep bleeding Genghis flaming Khan waiting. She could. I'm telling you, she's a woman of great talent. I know that, I said. And without her around, there's always the possibility that old Harry might get bored and wander off home and find Leroy, if you know my meaning. Well, that's covered. But you've got to remember that Leroy probably only needs about half an hour. So we all found ourselves round at my mother's house in the evening. The first part of it was given over to drinking. Monte Cristo cream, 48 tins of Guinness, 96 tins of bitter, 32 bottles of lemonade, and, so far as he was concerned, everyone was catered for. And I suppose they were, because within a few minutes everyone had a plastic cup of something or other. Eventually, of course, the riffraff started arriving. These are the neighbours and friends of my mother who, like her, lack any grace or beauty. Of course, old Harry fits right into that category. There he was, sitting down with, I reckon, a bleeding quadruple whiskey in front of him. There he was, sitting down with what I reckon was a bloody quadruple whiskey in front of him, and that I knew General Monty expression on his face. He saw me staring at him and wandered over. All right, young fella. About time someone made an honourable woman of your ma, innit? How many bloody kids you got now? And I reckon all by different fathers. Pardon, I said, because even I could recognise the need to defend my mother here. There are limits, even from the most unworldly of people. Oh, sorry, son. A bit tactless, innit? I mean, referring to, well, life's got to go on. We can't just ignore things just because we don't want to talk about them. I mean, I noticed Johnny Nigger and his missus and kid are here. I mean, who invited them for fuck's sake, I ask you? Jesus, you live in a place like Fazacurly precisely because you don't want Sambo around the bleeding place with his bloody music and parties and God knows fucking what. Well, you see, Leroy there is actually an employee of Alf's, so they're his guests, you know. I mean, he's entitled to invite his friends if he wants, I suppose. I mean, Alf is the groom, like. Well, I'm not going to go so far as to say that they'll spoil the night. I mean, I did spend time in the friggin' Western Desert and then there's blacks everywhere. Anyway, free whiskey's free whiskey, whatever the colour your neighbours or friends. Isn't that right? In fact, tell you a little story now. I'm about due for another one. Then the old bastard swigged down what must have been 70% of his quadruple in one go, and off he toddled to the table to get himself another one. By the way, he said, isn't that tart over there with Claudia, the one who, that night, you remember? Oh, you mean the night you got the push? I said. Not too loud, but loud enough for Claudia and Nancy to know that old Harry was maybe what they call on the sniff. Yeah, it is. Good friend of Claudia's, she is. Oh, friggin' sexy bitch, though. I can see her friggin' knickers nearly from here, and that blouse don't leave much to the imagination. Jesus, what a pair, eh? Mind you, you wouldn't be bothered with that kind of stuff, would you? You ain't got the fucking sense to know where to put it. I think I do know where, I said, but I'm not always that interested. Oh, me, I'm ready for it any time. Just give me a minute and I'm ready for the up. Never any bleeding problem for me, that. I can feel the bastard thing now. The tart's getting me going, I can tell you. Well, maybe if I introduced you, I said. Which of course I did. No one could say old Harry was lacking in charm. So he leans over towards Nancy, looking closely at her blouse the whole time, and says, Fill your glass, love. Get you another bevy, like. What is it, gin and lemonade there? Nancy said nothing and handed her plastic cup over to old Harry. When he turned his back on her, she gave me a very big and rather frightening wink. Then Claudia said, Bet the old bastard thinks he's on it again, eh? But even though it was Alf's wedding day, the occasion couldn't pass with some form of cock-up being conjured by the special talents of the groom himself. I've heard nearly all weddings have some form of high drama to remember them by. In this case, the low and embarrassing episode stemmed directly from the fact that they had broken from tradition, an observation made to me by some old relative of Alf's a bit later. Anyway, there was no wedding cake. It was my mother's idea, because she's got special talent in this direction. So they had a wedding pie instead. The pie would be a giant steak and kidney offering with enough food value to nourish the guests who had come along to the evening do. So what she did was borrow one of those great big catering trays from the local school and make this pie all ready for the evening. First of all, you could hear whispers about a cake, and then you got the impression that something big was going to happen when they brought out the silver knife. People started to get excited because they were still ignorant of the real nature of this ceremony and what they were about to witness. The pie was hauled into the front room by my mother and another woman of fatter than normal proportions. I couldn't believe it when this woman turned to us all and said, Will yous all be preparing yourselves? Will yous all prepare yourselves for the cutting of the pie? Then someone said, Where's Alf? That, of course, was the moment of discovery. Alf was nowhere. Claudia said she knew where the drunken old fat bastard was, and I thought I probably did as well. But most of the company had very little idea of the true nature of the man or his habits. Next thing we knew was this woman saying, I hate to have to tell you this, love, but I don't know how to say it on his wedding day, but I mean, I was just going to the toilet. I'll have to ask the children to leave the room here, you know. She waited while the mothers shooed the kids away, including Evangeline. As I was saying, I was just going to the toilet, only for... I mean, I've had a few drinks, but not enough to... Anyway, so I hears this bloody funny noise, alright, like sighing and deep breathing coming from one of the bedrooms. And I didn't want to think what I was thinking, if you get my meaning. I mean, it's not even alright for bleeding teenagers, is it? In bedrooms and all that. So I thought I'd just better have, I'd just better have a little blimp. Could be anybody, bar the friggin' priest. So there I am looking into a bedroom with a double bed and two men with their arms around each other. When I look closer, there's your man Alf, with his face all nuzzled up to that bleeding best man fella, the friggin' lorry driver, like they were two Romeo and friggin' Juliets, for God's sake. Oh, I told you, didn't I? Said Claudia. Oh, thank God for that, Betty, said my mother. I thought you were going to tell me that a rupture. What would you go into the toilet like? Listen, the one thing I've learned about Alf, if he wants his kip, he sure gets his kip. I'm not sure that that's what my mother... What? I'm not sure that what my mother said did enough to allay the suspicions of Betty and all those around the room who'd taken the trouble to listen in and who were still all looking suitably shocked. There were plenty among them who were convinced that Alf Speed was a foul-mouthed pervert who had chosen my mother as a front for his wicked activities. But then the great man himself turns up and says, "What's with the sublime silence? Where's Mr. Steak and Kidney? For it's him I've come to stick my knife into." There was a bit of a gasp. It might have had something to do with the form of words chosen by Alf, but it seemed to do the trick eventually, and the cutting of the pie went ahead. Everyone got a piece of steak and kidney pie on a serviette, which did little to stop the gravy. However, I'm sure that irreplaceable damage had been done by the incident, especially when Alf entered the room, adjusting his trousers and rubbing his eyes, followed closely by Tommy, who was doing the same thing. The looks they received, God. "I could have told you about that bleeding ass bandit," I heard old Harry saying to Nancy. "I've met the likes of him before. I'll tell you, it's not pleasant. As we were saying, about the war. Thing is, Hitler wasn't all that bad, you know. The idea of a master race and all that's good stuff, that is." And then Leroy grabs me by the elbow, just as I was getting stuck into the pie, and whispers into my ear, "Time I come, brother Tedward, to do a bleed that my black heart no shame for." "What?" I said. "His place," said Harry, nodding to old... said Leroy. "His place," said Leroy, nodding to old Harry, whose eyes were virtually stuck to the front of Nancy's blouse. "I'm going to sort that little evil prick out once and for all. Hear what him said before about me and Claudia, Johnny Nigger and his wife?" Unfortunately, I had to nod in agreement.